I'm about to welcome Shirley Donegan. She's a lecturer from the Humanities Department at the University of Dublin, and she's going to be looking at the vital role of policy frameworks in shaping effective youth work in Ireland. Shirley, are you around? Can I bring you onto camera?
Yes, I'm here, Rory.
Fantastic. I've given you a little introduction, but is there anything else you'd like to say apart from that, or can we just say the floor is yours and do take it away?
No problem. Thank you very much for that, Rory. And hello, everybody. I suppose I was asked just to speak a little bit around the structures that we have here in Ireland in relation to youth work, and more importantly, the legislative structures and underpinning kind of that support the work that we do and the role that it plays with those. And I think there's probably going to be some crossover with within our context and your context. So forgive me if some of this is a little obsolete for the purposes of what you need here. But I suppose what I'm just going to go through is what the legislative underpinning has done for youth work within our context, and how we've been able to build on that. And then I suppose towards the end, some of the work that we still have to do. So as Rory said there, youth work is a profession of integrity. And because of that integrity, youth workers are often doing far above what it is that's expected of them, and doing it with little to no resourcing, and doing it very innovative and groundbreaking things without sometimes the support that needs to go with those. And in times of recession and funding cuts, youth work's budget is kind of always under the snip, kind of sooner than any others. So what we've found from having the Youth Work Act is that strong infrastructure is really important to support quality provision of youth work, and also the recognition and responsibility for it within government departments. So from our context, there was talk about the professionalism of youth work from as far back as 84 and probably before that. But the first time it was mentioned in a government report was in 84, about having some form of formal structure around it. It took until 1997 before the initial Youth Work Act came out. And that was a really positive step. But as soon as it was released, there was a change in government, which meant that it was no longer a priority for the new incoming government. And because of that, it wasn't enacted in the way that we hoped it would be. What did happen at that stage, and there were two very important parts that were implemented from that 1997 Youth Work Act, and that was the setting up of the National Youth Council of Ireland. So that's in relation to policy development, and also the National Youth Work Advisory Committee, which were there to oversee youth work and youth work provision. So because those two elements were set up, it drove the purpose for the full enactment of the Youth Work Act later on. The structures weren't there that were named in the Youth Work Act initially. So there was supposed to be education boards that would set up Youth Work Act, and that wasn't a priority for this government. So it went on the back burner for a while. But because we had the National Youth Council of Ireland and the Youth Advisory Committee, there was work being done in the background to allow us to perform some form of structures. But that legislative underpinning and that beginning of that was really important in terms of the development of youth work for many different reasons. And we'll go into those a little bit in a moment. But what it meant was that the government had to take responsibility for the development and coordination of youth work. And within those processes, it meant that it was given a little bit of credos, and it provided a framework on which to build. So the Youth Work Act then was finally passed as a bill in 2001. And it was specific to our context, which I imagine is quite similar to yours, in that our local areas would be quite different from each other's. And the Youth Work Act recognised the fact that though it was a legislative basis, but it was to support the voluntary nature of youth work in Ireland, which is really important to kind of the development and what youth work means in Ireland. What it also did was define the roles of the statutory bodies in terms of delivering youth services in Ireland, which meant that it was somebody's responsibility, which ultimately meant that we were taken a little bit more seriously, and there was somewhere to go if things weren't being done. So just an overview of the key purposes of our Youth Work Act. Number one was the definition, and the definition of youth work was quite important in terms of having a definition that was clear and concise, but also that demonstrated a shared vision in terms of an understanding of the purposes of youth work, an understanding of the origins of youth work in terms of volunteerism, etc. So the definition was quite important. And as a youth work educator and somebody who runs a youth project as well, I find that having something to define what it is that you're supposed to do means that you're a little bit more conscious of your practice. So the planned program, the developmental nature of it, the educational nature of it, etc., means that we have something to hang our hats on. What it also did was meant that there was a detailed kind of policy of budget research. So there was a monitoring and assessment function given to the minister that meant that they needed to oversee youth work practice. So that kind of formalized the processes of youth work, but still allowing the flexibility of volunteerism and addressing local needs. They founded vocational educational committees, and their role was to plan and prioritise funds. Now, they lay within the Department of Education, as did youth work at the time, and the prioritising of funds didn't always go towards informal education or non-formal education, which is what youth work is, and it was kind of seen as the poor relation within that. But from that, youth work committees were set up in each of those educational committee areas. The National Youth Work Advisory Committee oversaw structures and policy and drove the kind of vision of youth work forwards quite substantially. And had the Youth Work Act been kind of implemented without the advisory committee, it wouldn't necessarily have been as effective as it turned out to be. It's also quite unique in that it represents the voluntary sector, and it's committed to that voluntary nature of youth work, of the origins of youth work. And what that means is that it doesn't formalize it within, even though it has a legislative underpinning, it still remains flexible enough to be able to utilize within the context of the area that you're working in. And then it also had a national youth work, a national assessor for youth work, and their role was kind of to ensure the best value for money. But what they also did was act as a go-between between the sector and the government, which mediated a little bit in terms of what it was that the sector needed. And it also meant that it was a supportive role. So it was almost like having a voice at the bigger tables. In terms of the benefit that came from that legislative underpinning and why it became quite important for the development of youth work in Ireland was the associated structures that went with it. So the National Youth Council of Ireland, the National Youth Work Advisory Committee, the National Youth Work Policy or Development Plan, and the National Quality Standards Framework, which came in a little bit later. All of those additional policies supported that role of the Youth Work Act in terms of supporting youth work provision, ensuring quality provision, and ensuring that youth work where it was consistent as much as possible. So as I said earlier, the definition of youth work kind of gave strength and credibility to the vision of youth work and an understanding of what the purpose of youth work was supposed to be. Also for youth workers, it gave us a bit of a shared vision and a blueprint for developing and strengthening our youth services. We kind of, it promoted shared understanding and consistency in youth work practice. And it also lent a hand towards the professionalism of the sector. So because it's enshrined in legislation, people automatically consider it a little bit more important than they did before. But also we have a voice at tables. We have a minister. The benefit of youth work was starting to be recognised a little bit better, a little bit more, and continues to do so. Like I said, the Youth Work Act kind of provided the flexibility to respond to the needs of communities. So there's a recognition that youth work, in order to be effective, needed to be developed and delivered at a local level in line with the needs of local areas. So while we have it enshrined in legislation, it's not prescriptive and allows us a little bit of flexibility to be able to respond in a way that some more formal structures like, for example, CORU that we have here in Ireland, a registration body for social work and social care work, etc., is quite restrictive and quite formal in terms of its nature, whereas the Youth Work Act allows us the flexibility to work in a means that youth work does. It also stipulates the participation and inclusion of volunteers, as well as young people on voluntary youth councils, which again lends itself to what youth work is supposed to be: participative and inclusive, and it means that we have to stay true to that. So within the rise of that, we developed strong youth work practice. We find that when you go on to European conferences and stuff, the absence of those structures and the absence of degree courses and the absence of some of the things that our European neighbours don't have, that we have in abundance, kind of allows us to grow and develop youth work in a way that isn't possible without those structures. So I think it allows us to do more things. So while it developed youth work and it gave us a number of things that we could do, there's a lot of things that still, I suppose, needs to be improved. So it wouldn't be a critique without mentioning the things that need fixing also. So youth work remains important, but not a priority for governments. So we're still only just back to 2008 funding levels after the recession. We're expected to cope with increased demand when funding is quite short. Next year again, there's rumours that there won't be an increase in youth work budget, even though the cost of living and the cost of running a service has increased significantly. I'm not sure what the context is in Scotland, but it would be good to have all funding for youth work channeled through the Department for Youth, or the department that the Youth Affairs Minister sits in. At the moment, we have Garda Youth Diversion Programmes, and their funding comes from the Justice Department, which is at a completely different level than what we get from the Youth Work Department. And there's also funding pots given from the Department of Climate Change, which is to be used to work with young people, but rather than coming through the Department of Youth Work, it goes through climate and out in that way. So if money is to be given to work with young people, if it was all channeled through the same department, I think we might get better value for it. We've also, our new funding streams here have kind of returned to a little bit of performativity. We're looking at targeted funding streams, working with young people under labels, working with young people under specific areas and need. And that's something that we strove to get away from for for a long time in terms of youth work practice. But now, in order to be able to get funding and to work with these young people, we have to put them in categories again, which was never something that's that easy with us in the first place. What the targeted funding streams also mean is that there's a shrinking space for mainstream youth work. And because there's a shrinking space for mainstream youth work and there's a lot of targeted stuff going on, it's also a shrinking space for innovative practice and being able to develop new things and new ways of doing things, which would be most welcome, which means that youth work is eventually going to become staid. It has, well, there's more of a public perception than there was before. There's still a little bit of unsurety in terms of what youth work is and how it's different from different social science professions, and why it's a methodology of its own and an approach of its own. So there's a little bit of work to be done there. And then in our context in Ireland, we don't have a setup of paying conditions for youth workers, which means that security-wise, it's quite difficult to maintain staff and to hold on to workers long-term, because on rolling contracts, on with no increments, with no overseeing in terms of paying conditions, it's a little bit difficult for people to get a little bit of security within the profession. So while our legislation has helped to develop youth work a little bit, I think there needs to be a little bit more investment in terms of what's going to happen from now. I am a youth work educator. So in terms of being able to define what youth work is, being able to explain in one way what youth work is and is expected to do and how the process is, so that shared vision and shared understanding is really, really important. Which means that when we have degree courses, the students and graduates emerge with the same idea of what youth work is, which in turn gives us consistency of practice. As somebody who runs a youth project, having an understanding of what youth work is enshrined in law, but also having a responsibility that sits within a certain department, means that we know where we need to go if we want to challenge conditions, or if we want to advocate or lobby for better conditions. And as the chair of the North-South Education Training Standards Board, which seeks to oversee degree courses in youth work education and the professionalism of youth work, that legislative underpinning is really important. Working with the department is really important, and trying to push things on from there. So from my context, that's kind of what the Youth Work Act has given to us. I don't know if anybody has questions.
Shirley, thank you so much for that, first of all. And I'm struck by the long journey you've taken, kind of 40 years and 10 minutes there for everyone. Kind of the other sort of notes that I've kind of, the importance of the advisory committee. Guys, everyone here today, I want to say that's you in terms of the Scottish Government. You are on the advisory committee. You're the ones that need to be speaking into this situation. I was struck by the importance of that kind of ministerial sponsorship and that very senior sponsorship. And I was struck too, like, really about how act or no act doesn't solve all your problems, and that's still kind of gathering that range of funding sources. Can I ask you maybe just a single question, that despite it not being kind of a be-all and end-all, do you think youth work in Scotland, in our context, would benefit from having that Youth Work Act?
I think that legislative underpinning became quite important in terms of driving youth work on, in recognition, in shared understanding, in consistency of approach, of quality of practice, across the board, not just in pockets. So the kind of reliance on youth workers to be innovative and to be able to deliver on so many different counts was formalised in a way. And had we not had the Youth Work Act emerge when it did, I don't think youth work in Ireland would be in the position that it is now. So I think it did have a huge developmental capacity. I think the foot's come off the accelerator a little bit of late, and rather than that consultative process that we hoped and expected, it went a little bit different for a while. But at the moment, there's a huge consultation from all different sectors and stakeholders from youth work. So I'm hoping that impacts on some of the issues that we have at the moment. But for sure, the Act, but also the advisory committee, the quality standards framework, those supportive structures that went with that, the assessor for youth work, meant that it was more easily accepted by the sector, but also that there was a two-way feed. So the assessor fed from the sector to the government and vice versa, but in a supportive manner. So I do think it drove kind of where youth work has gone.
Oh, well, look, thank you so much for that. And I know from the chat, I can see there's appreciative comments as well. That risk there, finally, to highlight that if you get your youth work tax, it's all well and good, but they might consider it done and dusted after. Thank you so much for your input today, Shirley.
Thanks.